Welcome to the She He We Awakening podcast. We are a wife and husband therapy team whose professional and personal lives are centered on psychology and spirituality.
We love sharing what we've learned on our journey of becoming conscious through relationship, and we invite you to get to know us and hopefully hear in our stories something that can support you in your life too.
Hello, my love.
Hello.
We meet again.
Yes, I'm excited for today. So we received a question about Ouija boards, and somebody wanted to ask our opinion about whether Ouija boards were dangerous or evil or
real.
Or real. Yeah, to get our opinion on those. So we're going to talk a little bit about Ouija boards, but we're also going to talk about entities, dark energies, energy clearing, that kind of thing. And I think that our perspective on this, at least I'll speak for myself, my perspective on this has changed tremendously over the years.
Same.
From when I was first dealing with it and mostly being terrified, and to now not really thinking about it at all on a daily basis, not pondering it.
Right.
So,
well, where would you like to begin?
I think what would be useful perhaps is to begin to talk about how we first started learning how to do remote work. Mm-hmm. Because that was really my first contact with the concept of dark energies or evil entities or earthbounds, mm-hmm. Energies that are not a part of a person's like home energy system. Mm-hmm. And so we learned how to do remote work from our teacher, and we were taught to do this remote work, which is work that you do for someone who's not present in partners. So you and I would often do remote work together where you would be called the facilitator and I would be the surrogate, which means that I would be reaching out and making a connection with somebody who wanted to have some energy work done for them. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, we were taught to make a connection to this one's higher self. And I quickly learned that when you make a connection with someone's higher self, you're really kind of connecting with all of them. There's not me, and I always used to think, well, maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I never was able to connect with anything but the fullness of the person, mm-hmm. the wholeness of them. And then you would run me through a series of questions. We would ask permission to do the work. And then you would ask me a number of questions, all in the desire to help a person feel better and lighter and more free and more functional and less emotionally stressed, etc. And we would typically only do this remote work with people who were stuck in some way, or they were very young, mm-hmm. or they weren't able to participate in therapy themselves. So a person who's really, really sick, for instance, or a child, or somebody who was participating in therapy but was running into a roadblock and they couldn't make progress.
Right.
So can you tell me a little bit about how it felt for you when you were the surrogate? And then I'll share a little bit of what it was like for me.
Well, I have one distinct memory of operating as the surrogate and tuning into somebody else's energetic field or self, however you want to phrase it, and finding something there that felt really unpleasant, mm-hmm. right? And how it came through to me. So I'm cheating a little bit here by using language that more accurately describes my understanding now than at the time, right? But
sure.
How it came through to me at that time was that yes, there was some dark presence there, sort of adjacent to or connected to this person's energy system. Mm-hmm. And we go through a process of asking questions. What's going on here? When did this begin? How did it start? And sort of tuning into higher resources and asking for and directing things to sort of shift and correct, essentially, is a really simplified way of of putting it. And I remember, I mean, for me, the experience was subjectively real in that I really felt something distinct and different than what I had felt doing that kind of work for people before, and certainly from what I had ever felt in my own energy system. And it was the only time I remember doing that work where afterwards I sort of had a hangover. I mean, I really did not feel good, and I don't remember, but I'm sure I probably asked you to end up doing some work for me. I think you then did some hands-on energetic work for me at some point as well. So my experience was that, there was something real happening, but we'll come back around to that. There's so much nuance to this conversation that let's save that for a little bit later. Let's stay with this for just a moment. So does that sufficiently answer your question?
Yes, thank you. So, and I remember when we were doing more of this work, this was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, that I was more often the surrogate than you.
Yes.
And I think in part, the reason for that was that I was very sensitive and would often get a lot of distinct information from the sessions. And I think that's probably still true now to some degree. I am much more sensitive. And when I'm like really if I'm really focused, I don't even want to say if I let my guard down, because that's not actually true anymore.
Right.
If I really focus on someone else's energy system and their body, I can get a lot of information. And it kind of depends on how healthy and well I am that day. But I will get a lot of information. So when I used to do remote work as the surrogate, I would feel very strongly the feelings and sensations that the other person was experiencing. So if they were grieving something, I could feel the grief, as if it was my own. And, I got a lot of flack for that from the people that we learned this from, because that was not supposed to be good. Right.
Yeah, I think the way it was taught was that, something was happening here, but it definitely wasn't supposed to be you sort of deeply empathizing and really sort of stepping into that position, that there was supposed to be a very strict and rigid sort of barrier.
Yeah.
I would compare it to the idea, the difference between sort of knowing what somebody's thinking versus feeling their emotions. Right. The way that it was taught was more sort of rational and intellectual, that we can sort of tune into and get information on an intellectual level, but that we shouldn't actually ever go beyond that into sharing in the actual feelings and emotions.
And I, battled that in my own mind for a very long time. That's kind of a side point, but now I believe, for myself anyway, that this is me doing the very best job that I can. Feeling someone's feelings and feeling the sensations in their body and knowing thoughts that are happening enables me to be of most help. And I also know that comes with that has consequences for me. So it's not something I engage with very often anymore. At any rate, so I used to feel when there were uncomfortable energies, and I think at the time I used to call them, as we were taught to, dark ones.
Yeah.
And earthbounds and thought forms, and there were a number of different words that we were taught to use, that if you Google them, you'll find them in the spiritual communities. They're things that people use to label energies, sensations, or whatever. And I noticed that over the years, in the beginning, when I hadn't done a lot of my own healing, I was quite disturbed emotionally as I was doing this remote work for people. But as I did my own clearing and resolved more and more of my own emotions and was more emotionally stable myself, it became no big deal to do remote work. Whereas now it is no big deal. The only cost to me is that takes a lot of concentration to be able to maintain focus on someone else's energy system for a long period of time.
Mhm.
But otherwise, I don't have a hangover. I don't feel sick. I don't feel skeeved out like I used to.
Right.
So I used to believe in entities like demons and dark ones. And I mean, I can remember giving you all these names for these things. And you were like, okay, whatever. Like, you were always a little bit more pragmatic about this stuff than I was. But I was in
Yeah,
a phase, I was in a phase of
sure.
like needing to label things and have names for things.
Right. But I think we're already into the difficult nuance of this topic in this conversation, which is that despite how things have changed for us, I still wouldn't say, I'm not going to go sort of look back and say those experiences weren't real, or that the phenomena themselves weren't real. I would just say that my understanding of what's happening has changed dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so to me, it just depends. It depends on the lens, the perspective that we are taking into it and analyzing it through, that determines whether or not we would say these things are real.
I
Right.
would agree. I'm not saying that these things aren't real.
Yeah, I know.
I'm
I
saying
think it's important to clarify that we're not saying that.
the sensations and the energy that I experienced was real. What I didn't realize at the time is that I could have simplified the language a great deal.
Sure.
Instead of having names of like, well, I'm talking to an alien energy right now, or I'm
Or
talking
whatever.
to
Yeah.
somebody's long lost, ancestor from 200 years ago.
Yeah.
There was simpler language that I could have used. However, sometimes the simpler language doesn't provide for a person enough of a shift in their perspective,
Mhm.
right?
Agreed.
Do you agree? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So where I was going with this is that a lot of it comes down to the perspective and the level of storytelling, right?
Mhm.
And it's what stories are sort of the most helpful, most accurate, most useful. But at the highest level, so to speak, they're all just stories. They're all just, plays with characters that we're sort of conjuring up in the moment to describe some experience that's taking place. But I would say the same thing about every aspect of my life, right? That's the catch. And so that when I say, well, a lot of this has to do with making up stories that are useful, and I don't mean consciously making up stories. I mean the process of creating something out of our own unconscious with a story that helps us to navigate what we're experiencing and make sense of it. So when I say that some of these things had to do with storytelling, well, this is a story too. Me and you as separate people having a conversation in space-time. Like, to me, that's just as much of a story. So we're not denigrating all storytelling. We're trying to help, I think, people understand where the stories are useful and where they aren't. And as it pertains to this phenomenon of so-called dark energy, our understanding, I think, has evolved a lot, where a lot of the stories we told ourselves about what it was that's happening and how it worked really don't make sense anymore, and just feel like children's stories now.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's how they feel to me.
Yeah. So over the course of the years doing remote work, at first I took the energy, which was unfamiliar to me at times, and I thought, this is something new to me. I'm going to have to give it a name. And this was not a conscious thought process. It's
Right.
just
Right.
the way that my mind was working in those exercises. And so I would give it a name. Oh, this is a dark energy. Oh, this is a miasma. This is blah, blah, blah. Something to describe what I was perceiving through my mental sight or
Mhm.
my inner sight. And then what I realized as I went through the years is that everything just sort of simplified. And what I used to call a dark one was just some energy that the person was holding that they didn't know, that they had no contact with, or even some emotions that had not been moved for a long time, some leftover trauma in their system that they hadn't been circulating through or hadn't processed, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And I kept running into that over and over again, where I thought, yeah, I would have called this a dark energy before, and now I think it's just grief,
Yeah.
or it's just fear. And it was a real shift in my perception of, what's out there in the world. And everything to me now is quite simple.
Yeah. And I think you just used a phrase that to me is sort of the essence of the shift that has taken place. You said what's out there,
Mm-hmm.
in the world. But to me, the key part of that is the idea that these things are something that are out there, that they have their own sort of personification or individual consciousness that is distinct and separate and independent from the realm of humanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this idea, this story that there's us living humans and separate apart from us, totally independent and individual from us with distinct consciousnesses, are these things out there called dark ones or dark energy or evil spirits or demons
Or the devil. Yeah.
or the devil. Yeah, you
Yeah.
keep climbing up the ladder until you get to the devil, right?
Yeah.
That
Sure.
there is a functioning, separate, independent reality of evil that is in opposition to humanity or
Mm-hmm.
goodness or God. That's the big shift. And so again, the language is very careful, is very important here, and you have to be careful. I didn't say that those things aren't real, right? From the perspective of our human experience, I would say, yes, you can encounter those quote things. And I put things in quote because, again, to use the word thing is to give it some independent, separate autonomy, that it's an actual object distinct from my psyche or the collective psyche of humanity. That's the problem. They're not. And so, to me, these things are real in that there is something that we can interact with and have an experience of, and maybe we want to be cautious about and exercise caution when stepping into this territory, but it's not different from us, that it is in fact simply suppressed or repressed, or quote unquote damaged parts of our individual personal psyches or the collective psyche of humanity.
I want to say the same thing in just slightly different way.
Right.
So as I was going through this process of doing this remote work, doing my own healing, learning about a lot of different ways that people express themselves and show up on the planet, I got to know my own self a lot more. So the more I discovered about myself, the more I stopped projecting the unknown outside of me.
Right.
So when people showed up in a way that I didn't like, I didn't have that story of, well, they've got some dark energy,
Right.
which was my old story, which I used, the connotation was bad, like dark energy is bad.
Mhm.
And I slowly came to understand that dark energy is just not known. When the more I knew myself, the more I knew others, I could kind of sense the patterns. Like I found the pattern within myself and I could see the pattern outside of myself. I'm saying that for practical purposes.
Yes. I'm following. Yes.
And so I didn't see dark energy anymore.
Right.
The less I saw it in myself and was confused and wasn't sure what was inside, the less I saw confusing things, disturbing things outside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, another phrase that you just used that I think is really important, but also needs some clarification. You said the less you saw this dark energy in yourself. I think it's important to understand that first, what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean rejecting the idea that there is darkness within us. That's the problem to begin with, right? So this is, for those who are interested, can dive into depth psychology. This is sort of Jungian psychology, psychodynamics 101. The idea that our wholeness includes light and dark. And that when we talk about getting to know ourselves, we're talking about getting to know ourselves as that entire spectrum of light and dark. And that the more we refuse to look at, acknowledge, and explore the darkness, in Jungian psychology, that's called shadow work, right? That the more we refuse to do that, the more the reality of that darkness, so to speak, within us, which is really just the unknown, in particular, the unknown that holds all of the things we have judgment about, all of the unsavory unknown, the ugliness within us, that the more we refuse to acknowledge and explore that ugliness within us, the more likely it is that then gets projected out and shows up as these so-called independent objects in space that we then have encounters with, and we sort of point over there and say, demon, dark one, bad guy, evil, right? That whole thing is taking place because we're not really truly seeing that those things actually dwell within us, right? So when you said you stopped seeing those things within you, it isn't because, or you stopped seeing darkness within you, it's because you changed. Here I am explaining for you again yourself. It just happens. It's
I
just
don't know
what
that
I do.
I said that, but okay.
Well, I'm pretty sure that you said you stopped seeing the darkness within yourself.
I don't know what I said.
Okay.
Well, I don't mean that literally.
No,
what I meant.
Okay, great. Then here's a chance for you to explain what you meant. I'm always in favor of that.
I stopped seeing the darkness inside of me as something that needed to be eradicated or fought or in conflict with. It's not a problem. I know what I'm capable of.
Yes.
I know what humans are capable of. And instead of having an adversarial relationship with darkness, I have a cooperative relationship with darkness where I'm always asking the darkness, what do you need? Yeah. So even in the language, when we used to ask for dark energies to be cleared from a person, we used to say, and we ask now for the angels of love, for example, to lift all of this dark energy, transmute it in love, returning it to its true place in the light.
Right.
So that sends the impression of like scooping something out of someone, fixing it, and sending it away, like someplace happy.
Right.
That's probably not how it was intended, but that's the language gives that connotation. And I remember at some point you and I changed the language to illuminate the darkness and allow it to integrate.
Yep.
Something like that.
Yep.
Which to me just means shine a light on this unknown thing in your own psyche and get to know it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So yes, great. I love that you explained that, and I didn't have to be mansplaining like I do every time we have a conversation. Yes, but it's such an important distinction, right? That's the process. It's a process of recognizing the darkness and shadows and working with it and integrating it, knowing that it is actually a part of us. And so then we run into one of these grand paradoxes that can never really be sort of overcome at the level of the human intellect. That's when you have unknown within you, when you have darkness within you, and you get to know it and you, quote, shine light on it, right? is it still darkness? And there isn't really a yes or a no question to that, because we can't really say, well, no, it's not. Well, then we get back to the problem of all there is within us is beauty and the light. And it's like, okay, that's nice at the highest level of truth, but that's not really sort of the practical experience of being a human being. And so if we shift into that mode, then we're back to suppressing the reality of what it means to be human, which is that at the very least, the potential for darkness is always there, or darkness is always there. And the potential for that darkness to be unknown and to exercise its influence over us in ways that appear to be evil, that potential is always there, as long as we're in the business of being human. So we can't just outright reject it. But at the same time, when we do explore it and get to know it and shine light on it, there's some sense of knowing that takes place, where this darkness is no longer darkness in the way that we've conceived of it before. Right?
I want to read a poem from a period of time when I was doing this work and I was in particular working with a certain type of energy. If you want to call it a type, it's not a type, but we have to label it, called the devouring mother. And I'm sure you can say more about this in a minute, because I know you know a lot about it. So the name of this poem is Devouring. And it goes, I'm standing in the bones. Everything here is cold and damp. My Red Riding Hood is not enough to keep out the chill of your breath, that sinking feeling in my stomach. I know why. You are here to eat me whole. In my essence, I am joy. That's the food upon which you thrive. But if I let you consume my spirit, I'll die, like the women and men before me, who lived their hollow, frustrated existences under the stare of those yellow eyes. I won't let you eat me, even though the thought of oblivion, so tempting in this pain. Instead, I will show you kindness. I will sing you a love song. I will bring you roses, and I will build you a nest. You are my mother, and if we make peace, my heart will soften. Maybe we can lay together and remember our wholeness. So the perspective of the poem is that of the light. It was me processing this fear of the darkness. And so I gave it an image, almost like a scary dragon or like a wolf. And I'm wearing my Red Riding cloak, like I'm a little girl facing the darkness and recognizing there's danger here in this darkness, potential danger. If I let the darkness consume me, the fear, the rage, the anger, everything that I associated with darkness at that time, I would die. My joy would die. But instead, I went down into the darkness and I was kind to it. I built it a nest. I made it a place to exist. I allowed it to exist. I fed it. And I laid down, metaphorically, with the darkness and welcomed it. Yeah.
That's sort of the essence of the necessary change in relationship, right? And I think one of the more famous examples of this is Dante, another poet, whose Divine Comedy, specifically the first book, the Inferno, is very, very well known. And that's a story of him taking a tour of hell, essentially. Right. But the gist of the poem is that he recognizes, a lot of this is implied, but it's well understood, that Dante himself, the human being, this is a story of his own inner exploration of his psyche. And he recognizes in the story, in the poem, that he needs to go on this journey. But basically there's two ways, and this is all throughout mythology, there's two ways to sort of do our due diligence around hell. Either we go on a voluntary tour of it, like Dante does with a guide. So in
through
the
therapy
poem,
or something.
yeah, in the poem he has Virgil, the poet from antiquity, who leads Dante through the 9 circles of hell and explains what everything is and points out, and all of these revelations come up. And as a part of that, Dante has to actually go all the way down to the center and touch Satan and crawl over Satan and then come up out the other side. So that's option 1. Option B is to be dragged to hell, kicking and screaming, right? But the moral of all of these types of stories is that we're going to have our experience of the darkness, whether we do it kicking and screaming and being afraid of it because we don't want to face the reality of what it is and what it means about us. And if we choose that option, then that's the experience of being in hell. Right? Whereas Dante's actual journey through hell, all the way to the deepest pit of hell, wasn't personally a hellish experience in that same way, because he was doing it voluntarily and had a guide and could avoid a lot of the kind of major pitfalls and suffering that otherwise accompany being in hell, not voluntarily. Right. So yeah, I love all your poetry. Every time I hear one of your poems, I'm like, that's my favorite one. So yeah, I think that captures the essence of the shift, which is that it's not that these things aren't real in a practical sense. It's just that they're not real in a way that they're independent and fundamentally opposed to our existence. All of this energy is really a part of us, either individually or collectively, and it ultimately has to be integrated, and we have to make friends with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I feel like that's a good transition back to the practical question of the Ouija board.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's such a good symbol, right, for where we are with this stuff. So as people listen to this, if you sit down, think about the idea of sitting in the dark with 1 or 2 or 3 of your friends and lighting a candle or 2. All the lights are off, the house is quiet, it's midnight, and you start to play with a Ouija board and ask for whoever, or just say, we're open, okay, who's here, and wait for this thing to start moving. How do you feel inside? Right? That's probably a good it's probably a good litmus test for
pretty bored.
where you are for what?
Pretty bored.
Yeah. For where you are in relationship to yourself. And what I mean by relationship to yourself is relationship to the reality of the darkness and unknown and everything that entails, that is a part of your psyche, right? So if you are just absolutely in horror at the idea of doing that, it scares the hell out of you. Maybe biologically, physiologically, you are just like fundamentally afraid in a very animal sort of way. Or there's an intellectual thing that pops up that says, no, God doesn't like that, and the fear is more sort of moralistic and Judeo-Christian judgment sort of fears. However it's showing up, that's pointing out the level of resistance that there is to the reality of the human psyche in its totality, right? You and I now, years later, having been in other places with this previously, now you and I think have the same response, which is like, what are we, this is stupid. because we know that whatever happens, it's just us doing it, right? And I'm not capable of like scaring myself that way. Like, if the thing starts to move and says, I am here, I am the dark, I'd be like, oh yeah, I know you.
Hello.
Yeah,
I know
nice
you.
to see you again, right? But again, if we're having a different experience of existential fear or religious concern, then it's pointing out to us the level of resistance that's there. And this is important. If that's happening, I would not suggest that you proceed. I'm not saying, right, and I know neither of us are saying that. We're not saying, oh, you just don't understand it and it's harmless, so just do whatever. No, that's not true. Because if there is fear there, and there is that resistance, and then what that means is that there are aspects of your psyche that do contain the potential for evil that you aren't in touch with, that's been suppressed. And that potential energy is absolutely real. And if you're that afraid of it, then I would not suggest inviting it to show itself. At least not that way. Right? Like go to therapy and invite itself to show it that way. Do authentic shadow work, do hypnotherapy, do dream work, have a good conversation with a therapist that can help you begin to take your tour of hell voluntarily. Don't fling the gates of hell open and stand at the front door going, all right, come at me. Like I definitely don't recommend that. Because there is a reality to it. It's not real in the way that people are afraid of, but that doesn't mean it can't impact us.
Yeah, I think that makes the people that I know that I work with who are more sensitive to dark energies and concerned about dark energies have not perhaps completed their shadow work, if one ever does, theoretically ever does. They don't know enough about their shadow, and if they also are afraid that they are not in control, that if presented, that they'll be tempted,
right?
That there's too much temptation. So it creates this need to externalize the darkness and be in combat with it at all times.
Right.
You're absolutely right. Those people, you're right, don't dabble with stuff. If you aren't in the place where you feel neutral or somewhat friendly towards your own darkness, don't go there. And I know that a lot of our clients, people we know, I mean, not even clients, go into things like ayahuasca experiences, or other kinds of psychedelic experiences, and they are abruptly confronted with hell. And it can be very disturbing you flung the doors open. On that, you're going to need a Virgil to walk you out again, or to help you process what you saw.
Right.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with doing those experiences, but be prepared for being thrust into hell and have yourself resourced. Right. Ouija board probably wouldn't do it, just because at this point, like you said, what would be the point? I might do it as a joke.
Sure.
To be amusing, but I certainly wouldn't expect to glean any information from it.
Yeah, and even in general, even for people who have some degree of comfort, still probably not the best mechanism. Just because right out of the gate, there's all of these associations, right? These collective unconscious associations, not even unconscious, just collective conscious associations of what the Ouija board is, and it's got this sort of dark, we've seen it in too many movies, and occult and things like that just as soon as most people open one up, they're already immediately in the wrong energy. Right. It's like, you just can't win. And again, that's not because there's something fundamentally evil or scary about a Ouija board. There's not. It's all there is to the Ouija board, and all there is to darkness is what you're bringing to it.
Thank you. That's a very quotable quote.
Great.
And I want to just add one thought. To me, it's not sacred enough either. Like, if I'm going to be with the darkness, I'm not going to whip out a Milton Bradley game board. I'm going to put on some beautiful music and take out my journal and light a candle and bring something light with it. Like, bring illumination with it.
I like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Can I read one more poem before we're done?
You can read as many poems as you'd like, love.
Here's something a little further along in my journey. It's not, well, it's pretty close to where I am now, and it's called Shadow Dancing. One day I stood in front of the light, and then I turned my back to it. I found myself facing my shadow. She was bigger than I expected, and at first I didn't want to look, but I bravely looked inside of myself and to ask, what does the shadow want? The goddess herself answered, be aware of me and let me join you in the sacred dance of life. I want to be a part of it all, and I want you to know me. So I let her join. I began to dance with my shadow. I even reached out my arms to her as if to embrace her. I was surprised to feel her arms reaching back to me, wrapping me in love. Had I known how lovely it would be to hold this part of me so close, I would have invited her to dance sooner. The light created the shadow. The shadow loves the light. Be in relationship with both and know the full expression of love. The end.
Love that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's certainly our experience, right? I mean, that certainly speaks to me in a very personal way as well, of the reality of what it is to get to know even the ugliness within yourself. And again, when you know the ugliness, is it still ugly? Right? That's not really, right? That doesn't mean it's become something else. It still is what it always was, but it's just not perceived in the same way anymore. It's interesting that our next tarot podcast is the High Priestess card, which has a lot of the associations of the things that we're talking about, the darkness. It's the unknown, right? It's the blackness and what it represents, the divine feminine, essentially, right?
Good segue then.
And also there's we won't get to it for many weeks, but the devil card, or more commonly now called the deceiver, is also a fun card to explore, because there's a lot in there symbolically that helps teach us what the reality of the devil is, which, to summarize, really is just the unconscious magician, essentially. It's us in a state of unconsciousness. That's all. That's all there is to the devil, and that's all there is to darkness, and therefore evil. It's just that aspect of self that's unknown, and it's not just that it's unknown, but it's forcibly unknown, right? It's resisted and suppressed. Whereas your poem I think, captures the essence of the true reality of the unknown, which is its benevolence and its love and its beauty. But that's in the form of this paradox where it's us looking at and knowing the unknown, right? And so again, we're left with, well, then is it even the unknown anymore? The answer is yes and no, right? Okay.
That feels good.
Great. Let's go conjure up some spirits.
Okay. Till next
Bye, everybody.
time.